that made it easy to blame Dallas because it was indeed a very conservative city, and there were demonstrators greeting Kennedy with anti-communist signs and that kind of thing. And civil rights was not real popular in Dallas at the time. So that was also difficult to process. Are you kidding me? A communist kills the president in Dallas? That can't be true. And then, of course, you have Ruby shooting the president 2 days later, or shooting the assassin 2 days later in police headquarters. It wasn't that a bunch of people got together and laid a plot. They're ready to go with it somewhat autonomously. So, yes, I mean, you point to kind of a scary thing about our public life, and that aspects of it can be manipulated so easily. I remember when COVID started, just before that, I thought when I looked at Trump's numbers, I thought, the only thing that could derail Trump would be something we can't foresee, like a war or something like that. Well, within a month, we had the virus. And, some people don't think that was an accident. So Kennedy was pressing that. Kennedy was a big Cold Warrior. Kennedy was not soft on communism. He was a Cold Warrior. He confronted Castro, wanted to assassinate Castro, and was sending troops to Vietnam or advisors to Vietnam and so on. Well, the idea that Columbia University has turned into a hotbed for Hamas is pretty crazy, because when you think about all the Jewish professors and thinkers and leaders who've been at Columbia and all the students at Columbia on the Upper West Side of New York, the fact that it's turned into, a hotbed for Hamas and the horrible things they do is very strange.
I'm honored today, this is Dr. Randy Bach, to have with me James Piereson, who is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And he should have been a gambling man, because he, I think, consistently pointed out that, I guess, the Occam's razor principle regarding the JFK assassination. We're going to be talking about that, and possibly at times his book, Camelot and the Cultural Revolution, how the assassination of John F. Kennedy shattered American liberalism. And I'm honored to have him on our show, especially in light of the recent, release of the JFK files, as they were called. Mr. Piereson, thank you so much for being on.
Dr. Bach, thank you.
So, who did it? How and why? And why do we think? Why are we so resistant to simplicity?
Well, the latter question is the most interesting one. In other words, the interpretation in the aftermath of the assassination, which was strange. There's little doubt who killed JFK, shot JFK, and wounded Governor Connolly. Lee Harvey Oswald fired the 3 bullets. One missed. One hit Kennedy in the back and went through him and into Connolly. And a third hit Kennedy in the head and killed him in Dallas. The shots were fired from Oswald's rifle that he had ordered by mail order 6 months earlier. The bullets found in the car were fired from that gun. The shell casings were found up on the 6th floor of the school book depository where Oswald worked and where he had been seen a short time before. Spectators on the street saw a man firing from that window, gave the police a description of the man. That description went out over police radios within 15 minutes of the shooting. And it was picked up by officers around the city who began to look for a man fitting the description. Oswald managed to sneak out of the building before the police were able to seal it off. Got on a bus, then jumped in a taxi, took it to his rooming house in another section of the city where he's living apart from his wife, retrieved a pistol, changed his coat, dashed out of the rooming house out onto the street. Within 10 minutes, he was stopped by a policeman, J.D. Tippit, in a suburban area of the city. Walking briskly, the policeman stopped his car. Oswald's on the sidewalk. The policeman waves him over to talk to him, and he's not satisfied with the answers Oswald is giving him. Oswald gives him an ACLU lecture about his rights. The policeman steps out of the car. Oswald fires several shots, kills him. The officer falls in the street. Oswald walks around behind the car, puts another bullet into the policeman, and runs away. Several spectators, people on the street, saw him do this. They gave descriptions of him to the police. They traced him within 20 minutes to a theater nearby. They went in, turned the lights on, arrested him. He tried to fire the pistol while he was being arrested, but he still had the pistol that was used to shoot the policeman, and he was then arrested. So, those facts are pretty clear. And, one wonders why there has been so much confusion after the fact about it. Norman Mailer, no conservative, had real questions about the JFK assassination. But he finally concluded that the shooting of Tippit was a kind of a tip-off that it must have been Oswald who shot Kennedy. Because, why would he shoot the policeman? Well, he was desperate and running away. And there was no doubt that it was Oswald who shot the policeman. So, those are kind of the facts. Now, there are a lot of things that clouded it up. One thing in particular was the fact that Oswald was then assassinated in police custody by Jack Ruby 2 days later. So there was never a trial. And as a consequence of that, Lyndon Johnson appointed a commission, the Warren Commission, to study the assassination and come back with a report, which they did 10 months later in September before the election. It was a hurried job. Johnson wanted it out well before the election. And the members of the commission did it on a kind of a part-time basis. Some of it was slapdash. There are aspects of it that were not complete and added to the confusion that people felt after the assassination. But, those facts, as you look at them, seem pretty clear. Then you could ask the question, what are Oswald's motives? Well, the New York Times, the day after the assassination, after Oswald had been arrested, laid out the facts pretty clearly that this is a man who had defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, former Marine, lived in the Soviet Union for 2.5 years, married a Russian woman, then returned to the United States in 1962 with his Russian wife and relocated to the Dallas area, and had somewhat become obsessed with Castro, especially in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So the New York Times had all this the day after the assassination. In other words, the blunt facts. And if you go back and look at that article, none of those facts have really been challenged to any significant degree that the Times reported. Stop me whenever you think I've gone on long enough, but adjacent to the article about Oswald on the front page of the New York Times on November 23rd, 1963, was a column by James Reston. Reston was the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times and probably the dean of political writers, journalists in the United States at that time. And his column went on to suggest that it was a spirit of a climate of hatred in the country that led to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And he linked it to violence against civil rights workers across the South and an attack on United Nations ambassador Adlai Stevenson, who had just been to Dallas a few weeks before. and basically disassociated the act from the Cold War and from Oswald. So Reston kind of painted a picture of the assassination that suggested that it was deep forces of hatred in the United States that were responsible for Kennedy's death. And when you ask which of these two narratives was going to determine how the public interpreted the assassination, was it an act in the Cold War, as suggested by Oswald's Soviet and communist background, or an event in the civil rights movement, as evidenced by the presence of right-wingers in Dallas and events that had taken place across the summer of 1963? Well, it turned out the dominant interpretation, narrative as we now call it, was that this was an event in the civil rights movement. And he was a victim, Kennedy was a victim of forces of hatred and intolerance and bigotry in the United States.
No, it's incredible. And, when I was a kid, there was a cabinet we lived in the Bronx in an apartment. Well, there was one cabinet, so we didn't have storage and whatnot, but there was one cabinet my parents said, don't go in there. Don't look in that one. That's not for you kids to open up. And so obviously, we weren't, alone that much, but first available opportunity, what do you want to do? You want to figure out what's in that cabinet. This kind of the shroud of mystery is intriguing. It seems as if, to ruin in a metaphor, the CIA and whatever are the agents sort of shot themselves in the foot by having, things kept from view. I think the lack of clarity made this kind of a moral hazard, an attractive nuisance, like my parents' liquor cabinet. Don't look in that. Don't go there. This is not something for you to look at. And everyone is always mystified by nothing else in the house except the thing you can't look at. And it seems to me that, whatever, no pun intended, whatever Warren commissions there were, the greater sin was the Warren omissions of not having the kind of the plain facts laid out, and or to use the term of the day, kind of the bully pulpit that would countermand whatever spin was put out by James Reston and surprisingly, shockingly, the New York Times and so forth. We see this over and over again, but so what's I don't know if there's how you want to approach this, but what's the underlying story? What's the message we need to learn from this, and have we ever learned from it?
Yes, a lot of questions there. Of course, we kind of learned a lot in recent years when Donald Trump became president about various things called the deep state and how forces within the government can kind of act on their own to neutralize or reverse political decisions. We've learned a lot about censorship coming out of Washington. We didn't think this was possible. And we wouldn't have known it had Trump not been elected. But some of this, or a lot of this, was present in the whole Kennedy assassination and its aftermath. And there are a lot of elements to it. If you just take Castro and the CIA. So one of the members of the Warren Commission was Allen Dulles, who had been director of the Central Intelligence Agency until 1962 when Kennedy fired him, partly over the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs. So you have in the room on the Warren Commission someone who's very much aware of what the CIA is doing. And that would include plots that the Kennedy administration was putting together to kill and assassinate and overthrow Castro. In the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy had made a promise that he wouldn't try to overthrow Castro and would not do another Bay of Pigs. But he didn't follow through on that and gave directions to the CIA to do anything they could to get rid of Castro. Robert Kennedy pushed the CIA and continually asked them, what are you doing to get rid of Castro? none of this came out in the Warren Commission report, even though Alan Dulles is sitting on the commission and could have revealed a lot of it. That would have told us a lot about Oswald's motives in trying to kill Kennedy, in that the CIA was trying to assassinate Castro. That would have been one of his motives, to prevent that from happening. So they did not let that out. It did not appear in the Warren Commission. It only came out 13 years later in a congressional investigation into the assassination. And this was in the aftermath of the exposure in 1975 of a lot of CIA secrets. So there was no aura surrounding the CIA any longer in 1977 as there was in 1963. But the public was not aware of this in 1963. It did not come out in the Warren Commission report. The other commissioners didn't know about it. And they interpreted Oswald's deed as a personal thing. He didn't get along with his wife. He had trouble holding a job. He had problems with authority. He was stifled in his career, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's not talk about the fact that he defected to the Soviet Union. He belonged to various socialist clubs, read socialist literature. And we can go into this also. Right in the aftermath of the assassination, they discovered that he had been the one who tried to assassinate the head of the John Birch Society in Dallas the previous April. And it was for that purpose that he ordered the mail order gun that he later used to kill Kennedy. So those facts were not known and were not emphasized. Another factor that was not emphasized was that Oswald, in September of 1963, left his family behind in Texas and took a long bus trip to Mexico City to visit the Cuban and Soviet embassies in search of a visa to travel first to Cuba, then to the Soviet Union. And he had some altercations with the officials in the embassies. He had some harsh words about Kennedy in those interactions. He was told that you can't get a visa right away. We have to do some background checks and we'll look into it. Several weeks later, he did get the visa to travel to Cuba. This is like in mid to late October. But the CIA was taking photographs of those embassies, and they picked up photographs of Oswald going to and coming out of the embassies. And the CIA sent word to the FBI in Dallas to find Oswald, find out what he's doing. They were never able to track him down for a lot of reasons. And after the assassination, J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, disciplined a dozen agents in Dallas for failing to do their duty in finding Oswald. That was also not well known to the public at the time. So there are a lot of what we call machinations by the CIA and the FBI to cover their rear ends in the aftermath of the assassination. Now, as I said, there are various aspects of it that were very confusing to the American people and was difficult for them to digest. And perhaps it made it easier for them to absorb this idea that this was an event in the civil rights movement. For one thing, you have a young president, 46 years old, handsome, beautiful young wife, 2 young children, assassinated on a public street in the prime of his life, very popular at the time. He probably would have been reelected at the time. So this was difficult to absorb. It might have been different if the president had been someone other than a vigorous young man like Kennedy was. On top of that, you had the fact that you have a communist killing the president in a right-wing city. How do we register that? That made it easy to blame Dallas because it was indeed a very conservative city, and there were demonstrators greeting Kennedy with anti-communist signs and that kind of thing. And civil rights was not real popular in Dallas at the time. So that was also difficult to process. Are you kidding me? A communist kills the president in Dallas? That can't be true. And then, of course, you have Ruby shooting the president 2 days later, or shooting the assassin 2 days later in police headquarters. So all those things kind of came together to weave a web of confusion over the Kennedy assassination.
But what was well known was Marina Oswald. I mean, it was unavoidable that's kind of an obvious public record. The guy's married. He was still married, whether separated or not. I don't know if there were children or issue from that marriage, but this was, before, Freddie Laker's airline, back and forth, shuttling people to Europe, and Iceland Air or whatever. It was a big undertaking to wind up in Minsk in, 1959 or 62, whatever the year was, and there's, I don't know how much of that was put out at the time. I was 7 years old when JFK got shot. I was coming back from a Cub Scout meeting. Not that anyone really puts weight into that. I have an alibi, but aside from being 7, anyway, that's not a usual thing in Dallas or anywhere, to have a Russian wife at the height of the Cold War, and to merely travel to the Soviet Union at that time was an oddity and a rarity. They weren't just letting everybody in; they had a closed border, and Winston Churchill dubbed their various frontiers an Iron Curtain. It was not an easy thing. It was not a common thing, and even amongst communists here, I don't think any of them wound up like traipsing through the Soviet Union. I don't think the Rosenbergs did. You tell me. I don't remember, Alger Hiss and so forth. So he's kind of like a communist amongst communists. I mean, this is just not a usual guy. And whether he was it sounds like he was a bit of a lone wolf and whatnot, but, could he have been co-opted? Could he have been given the right circumstance? He didn't have money. He could have used money. I don't know if anybody pursued the bank accounts and whatnot. But it just seems like a pretty obvious story that is purposefully misused, mislaid, misrepresented, and generally missed.
Yes, Oswald's only 24 years old when he shoots Kennedy. He's still a young man. And he defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, roughly at the age of 20, 21, after he left the Marines. And you raise a very good question, because, first of all, how did he get to the Soviet Union? Well, he used various ruses. He said he was going to Switzerland to study. And by that means, he got to Switzerland. Then he went to Finland on the border of the Soviet Union, and then took a bus into Moscow. So he had a plan to get to the Soviet Union. And this was a plan that he picked up from somebody. No one is sure where he picked it up. A friend, Edward J. Epstein, who's written on Oswald, suspects that when he was stationed in Japan, he left the base and consorted with communists in Japan and laid a plan to defect to the Soviet Union. And I should step back and mention that when he was at that air base as a Marine in Japan in 1961 and 1962, he observed U-2 aircraft taking off to fly spying missions over the Soviet Union. That was a top secret mission. Eisenhower had to authorize the flights, President Eisenhower in 59, and then afterwards Kennedy had to. So it was an odd-looking airplane, the U-2, with long wings, and it flew straight up in the air, and they observed that. So Oswald had seen this, and it is somewhat speculated that within 6 months of his defection to the Soviet Union, Francis Gary Powers' U-2 aircraft was shot down over the Soviet Union and taken prisoner. There were certain speculations that Oswald gave them, the Soviet Union, the information they needed to shoot down that U-2 because it flew at about 80,000 feet, and they had to have surface-to-air missiles that went that high. The CIA looked into that and never really authenticated that fact. But when Francis Gary Powers returned to the United States after he'd been exchanged for a spy, he claimed that it was Oswald who gave the Soviets the information to shoot down his U-2. But in any case, when he showed up to defect to the Soviet Union in 1959, he went to the American embassy and threw down his passport. And he told the official there that he was going to give the Soviets top secret information, classified information, which of course angered the embassy official. But he talked Oswald into keeping his passport rather than giving it up. Oswald checked into a hotel, but it turned out the Soviets didn't want to keep him. They wanted to kick him out. So Oswald slit his wrists, tried to commit suicide, wound up in a hospital in the Soviet Union, and they felt they had no choice but to take him. And so in the fall of 1959, he disappeared into the Soviet Union and wound up in Minsk working for a factory where he met his Russian wife. No one really knows, at least on our side of the Cold War barrier, what Oswald did in that roughly 2.5 years he spent in the Soviet Union. Did he acquire a legend of some sort with a mission to come back to the United States to do something? No one knows. In any case, in the spring of 1962, he said he wanted to come back. The American policy was then to repatriate people who'd fled to Korea or the Soviet Union, and they brought Oswald back. The question could then be raised, why didn't the CIA debrief him when he came back, find out what he did in the Soviet Union, what he knew? Apparently, the CIA did not really do that. There's some dissension about that because of links he had in Dallas with people who might have had connections with the CIA. But there was no systematic debriefing. And he came back with his Russian wife, settled in the Dallas area, and tried to find employment, but without giving up his communist beliefs, which he now, though, transferred to third world figures like Ho Chi Minh and Fidel Castro and Mao to some degree, because, as he claimed, the Soviet Union was as bureaucratic as the United States. We don't know if we can believe that, but nonetheless, there it is. So, was the CIA derelict in not looking into this guy when he came back? Why did they let him back? Why didn't they watch him more closely? Now, it is true the FBI did monitor Oswald in Dallas somewhat loosely. And as I say, they couldn't find him in the months leading up to the assassination because he had taken an assumed name and was living apart from his wife. So this was a very shadowy character. And he did make a statement to somebody in Dallas, roughly at this time, about his wife, saying, "My wife never will understand why he came back to the United States." He kind of left it there. So, you raise a good question. Given Oswald's background and all the things he had done, why was there such a mystery about what his motives were and who he was? A communist shoots the president and they blame conservatives and right wingers for it. In the city of Dallas, that clearly makes no sense. And, people looked at that and said, this doesn't add up. Something's wrong. And therefore, from out of that, you get the conspiracy theories. Now, as you do point out, the left always had a history of this sort of thing. Whenever an event happened for which the left might be blamed, they threw a shroud of controversy over it. The Rosenbergs, Elger Hiss, all sorts of things. They weren't guilty. They weren't communists. They were. This never happened reciprocally. If some right winger did something, there was never any effort of that kind to throw a cloud of controversy and confusion over it. But that is what happened in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination, because communists didn't want to be blamed for it. Now, there are other elements too which contributed to it. The Kennedy family did not want John F. Kennedy to be called a martyr to the Cold War, even though he was. They wanted him to have died for civil rights, even though he'd done very little for civil rights. At the time, he'd supported a bill very belatedly, but Jackie Kennedy herself said in the aftermath that it's unfortunate he was killed by a silly communist. It would have been better had he been killed for civil rights. That didn't make any difference. They went ahead and said the same thing anyway. Lyndon Johnson, if it was believed that Kennedy had been killed by communists, somewhat by order of the Soviet Union or Castro, that would have been an explosive international situation, which Johnson did not want. It was better for him to suggest that it was civil rights that Kennedy had died for. And in his first speech after Kennedy was killed, he said that our job is to pass the civil rights bill in honor of the martyred president. And all the communist and Cold War stuff was put aside for that reason. And the whole communist world, of course, wanted to deflect responsibility. The Soviet Union said that Barry Goldwater and the far right were responsible for it. So you had this confluence of circumstances, which basically threw a cloud of confusion over the whole event. And no one really knew how to interpret it. I saw a column by, I think it was Tom Wicker of the New York Times, a few years afterwards, and he wrote a column saying that Kennedy was shot by a crazy loner. Well, he may have been a crazy loner, but he was much more besides that. But that was the kind of narrative that developed, and then the conspiracy theories followed. Several years ago, Frank Rich, another columnist for the New York Times, I think he was writing about, I forget what he was writing about, another attempted assassination. But he basically talked about the right wingers in Dallas being responsible for Kennedy's assassination. And I think I wrote a reply to that, said that, that's not true. That's not what happened. There were right wingers in Dallas, but a communist shot the president. So, but I guess the point there is that, this idea still lingers. I think I also saw it in a history book that my son was reading, many years ago, that, Kennedy was shot as a martyr to civil rights. So this is, my son was in junior high school, maybe 20 years or so ago. But yes, it was an event that opened up possibilities for many interpretations, even though the facts, are pretty clear.
So while you're speaking, a lot of things flashed through my mind. So I'll just put them out there, and we can see which ones we want to attack. First of all, was it the Venona documents?
Venona.
Venona, thank you. So I want to touch on that. What of Oswald was in that, if anything? A. B. Benghazi. That was on one of the anniversaries of 9/11 a few years ago, and during Obama's term. And forget the Libyan ambassador Christopher, I can't remember his name, was killed, and it was clearly an Al Qaeda type operation, whatever branch you want to call it. And there were guns, being run into Syria and all this kind of stuff happening. and a lot of it was happening through Libya, apparently. And days later, it turns out that it was a video that had like close to zero, if you rounding error, zero views on YouTube, by an Egyptian Copt, maybe, referencing Muhammad, and that was the issue. This like huge diversion, and people, Susan Rice and everyone like was spouting this kind of thing, and went on for a while. It was a total, like, most obvious cloud done in the modern era, when people have all these facts and figures at hand, and people still go with whatever theory gets spouted. And I guess one other aspect would be Dr. Fauci and COVID. Now, what does that have to do with? There's nothing, except he adopted basically a line done by kind of the Chinese version of Pallywood, propaganda, people dying in the streets, and everybody, in white hazmats outdoors and whatnot. This was probably staged to a certain extent, and there was a Cold War of sorts, and certainly a trade war going on with Trump. They wanted to expel him if possible, and he was cruising towards re-election, pretty much the same, juncture of his presidency as JFK was in his. But that's a side note. 3 years in, and change, and Dr. Fauci kind of went with a whole Chinese narrative towards treating COVID, which was totally unnecessary. Well, why? So an underlying question with that, I mean, I've written on that topic, is why would you go with China over, say, the Diamond Princess was open sourced and whatnot? Why go with this concept of civil rights when it's open source? He's married to Soviet. Why go with the this obscure video when it's open source? It was Al Qaeda. I just don't understand. It seems to me so trivial and easy to be rebutted and to have puncture, but nobody does it. It's such laziness. Is it laziness, or complicity? This Hanlon's razor. We talked about Occam's razor earlier, but Hanlon's razor is never attributed to malice, that which can be chalked up to stupidity. And my friend has a corollary: never chalk up to stupidity with that which can be explained by incompetence. So it sounds like the CIA and FBI had some incompetence in investigating him, or malice, who knows, or stupidity or whatever. But then there's this, the fog of war, we understand. But these are times when there was no real wars except a Cold War, and people went with Fauci. They went with this, crazy, Muhammad movie. Why do our betters, our elites, go with the communist favoring narrative so often? And then the kind of puzzle question is, what in the Venona documents pointed to Oswald, if anything?
Yeah, Oswald is not in the Venona. The Venona documents were in the earlier Cold War period in the 40s and 50s, mostly about spies, Soviet spies, the Rosenbergs you mentioned. And they had been decrypted, and they were aware of those for a long time, but only released in the 1990s, I think. But they were aware, the officials were aware of them. There's another story about Oswald and the CIA that I'll circle back to, but you raised the question: how is it possible that the facts are one thing, and our press and our politicians circulate and interpretations that are adverse to the facts? How does this happen? And on the COVID thing, it's somewhat worse in the sense that they suppressed rival interpretations of COVID. You had the Great Barrington Declaration, it was signed by a couple hundred doctors, about masks and lockdowns and shutting down the economy, and young people versus old people, and virtually everything they said in the Great Barrington Declaration turned out to be true. Jay Bhattacharya was one of the people behind that. Scott Atlas was another. And they tried to, not only did they disagree with it, they tried to suppress it. And Bhattacharya and Atlas almost lost their jobs. And other people did lose their jobs over it. So you had that. So, we have a feckless and very stupid press. And unfortunately, it's a liberal left-wing press. And I believe A lot of this is done by Democrats and liberals, and I believe they wouldn't do it if they didn't have the press in their pocket. For example, Biden opened the border and let 10 million people through. The New York Times never reports that, neither do any of the networks. And it may have cost Biden the election, or the Democrats the election, because of the chaos it created. If they had covered it, the Democrats might not have done it in the first place. It might have closed the border and they would have been better off. But they know that they can do all sorts of things without any reckoning coming from the press. And if Fox News covers it, they just say that's a right wing publication or whatever, and you don't have to believe it. Um, so, uh, and then some of the politicians are aware that all they need is a story. And if it doesn't matter if the story's not true or even crazy, if I have a story to juxtapose against something, they have to cover them both. And when there's a debate, it doesn't yield anything. I remember the thing on Benghazi where they arrested this poor guy in California who had nothing whatever to do with it, and that was to, cement their story. Later, all the facts came out. The Kennedy thing is one of the first I found examples of this kind of thing. I'm sure it happened earlier in the Cold War too, with the Hiss case and so on. But they were ready to go with the civil rights interpretation of the Kennedy assassination the very evening. And the next day, I mentioned Reston. The night of the assassination, Chet Huntley went on NBC and said the assassination was a consequence of pockets of hatred in the United States. No mention of the communists. So it's interesting they were ready to go with that interpretation, really, before anybody had a chance to discuss it. It wasn't if a bunch of people got together and laid a plot. They're ready to go with it somewhat autonomously. So, yes, I mean, you point to kind of a scary thing about our public life, and that aspects of it can be manipulated so easily. I remember when COVID started, just before that, I thought when I looked at Trump's numbers, I thought, the only thing that could derail Trump would be something we can't foresee, like a war or something like that. Well, within a month, we had the virus. And, some people don't think that was an accident. But, who knows? But Trump got back. But
yeah. Well, my term of art for that is conspiracy of interest. It's not my original term, but it's not a popular term. It's not popular enough. The example till I come up with a better one is, bugs, mosquitoes, and like flies and rodents and whatever. They can't make you drop your ice cream cone in the street. Okay, they can't compel you to do that. They're not clever enough to do that. But once something like that happens, a hot day, you have soft serve ice cream, and it softly serves itself to the street. You're not going to pick it up. It's there. It presents an opportunity for other I don't know, little flies and insects, whatever, ants, whatever, to eat. Now they have to kind of figure it out amongst themselves. So it presents a situation for them that they're going to parse. Now the dropping is just a random thing. So I think COVID happened. I don't think it happened expectedly to China, but once it does happen, how can they, in the Alinskyite, realm, how can they make the most of that? It's as Homer Simpson, the philosopher, once said, it's a crisotunity. It's a crisis with opportunity. I think there's a more succinct, the Rahm Emanuel is like, never let a crisis go to waste. And that's, channeling Saul Alinsky, and I'm sure he channeled it from somebody else. But it's an opportunism to miscast and maneuver, because humans are clever things, and they can do with it, something with what they will. But the thing that kind of off pisses me a little bit, and it's always unidirectional. And why is it that our elites, when I grew up, the expression was country club Republicans, whatever. I don't think I belong to a country club. There's like no Republicans there. What happened to our institutions that, the press and whatnot are so kind of rabid and avid to push an inimical concept, communism, whatever, or socialism, whatever it is, which would kind of like obviate the need for their job. I mean, there's no real. I spent time behind the Iron Curtain in the '80s. We bicycled through Hungary and Czechoslovakia, as it was called, and a little bit of East Germany and whatnot. And it was a very cold, dark place emotionally. And people in the trains there, they only looked at the floor. They wouldn't deign or dare to look in anybody else's eyes amongst themselves, because it was a police state, basically a prison. Why do our universities, why do our press think that that's like a super cool thing? And why are they always kind of sticking up for that kind of concept? And Dr. Fauci, why is he defending the CCP? Go move there if you love it that much. I mean, at least have the gonadal fortitude of Lee Harvey Oswald to go live there. Like I don't. And the side question is like, why did Oswald become so fervently a communist? But that's a side note. Is that part of our education system? Is that in the water? I have no idea.
Well, again, a lot of questions there. Yes, there's a kind of liberal bias to all the interpretations of everything, as you say. Um, the birds don't have to be told it's going to rain. They kind of know it's going to rain. And that may be true of a lot of our elites. Why they decided, for example, they pushed so hard this idea that the virus jumped from a bat, when the more logical thing would be that it came from this lab right next door. That would be but as you say, Occam's razor, they jumped on the least likely explanation. And maybe that's one of the reasons why they had to censor any opposing view, because it made much more sense. China, they did bottle up those people who lived in Wuhan. On the other hand, they did let them travel over to Italy, where they did pass the virus on to Italians. And then Americans picked it up and brought it back to New York. I mean, that's kind of how it came back to the United States. If they were so diligent about the virus, why were they letting people fly to Italy? Good question. I don't know the answer to that. If we go back to Oswald, now, just to say on that, Westerners knew, journalists especially, how bad it was in the communist states, because all you had to do is travel to Berlin and look at one side of the wall and the other side of the wall to see the contrast between these two systems. Kennedy actually went in 1963 to Berlin and spoke on that after they put the wall up.
That's just, I am a jelly donut speech.
Yes, exactly. I'm a Bismarck or whatever. So Kennedy was pressing that. Kennedy was a big Cold Warrior. Kennedy was not soft on communism. He was a Cold Warrior. He confronted Castro, wanted to assassinate Castro, and was sending troops to Vietnam, or advisors to Vietnam, and so on. So he was not soft-headed. But the press, hires all these college graduates, and they hear the same song, they have the same narrative, and they bring it into the newspapers. So the big national newspapers and the networks all kind of get their information from the same sources. The Wall Street Journal news pages are not any better than the New York Times news pages.
No, it's a myth about the Wall Street Journal. I think that the reporters there are like, they have the same proclivities as the voters in Washington, D.C., it's like 95%.
Yeah, they're hired from the same schools. In fact, the Wall Street Journal bureau chief was just hired from Politico in Washington. So you have that. You ask, how did Castro become a communist?
No, Oswald.
Oswald become a communist. So that's kind of an interesting story, because another counterfactual aspect about Oswald that was confusing is because most communists are like academics. They've read Marx, they've read a lot of history, and they can lecture about Marx and capital and all sorts of things. Oswald barely finished high school. Most Marxists are somehow academics, or they're urban. Oswald was kind of raised in New Orleans and Texas, and he was not a particularly good student. How did he become a communist? Most people like him are kind of right wingers, but not him. Well, one, he claims to have picked up his communist sympathies when he was living in New York City. when he was about 13 or 14 years old. And his mother had moved there because her brother or brother-in-law lived in Staten Island. And Oswald, when he's 12, 13, 14 years old, would skip school and travel around on the subway, and he saw the flyers about the Rosenbergs. And because they had been accused at this time, and the trial was taking place at this time. And as he read these flyers, he became very sympathetic to communism. And somehow he held on to that because at this time, social workers visited Oswald's mother and queried him about missing school and that sort of thing. She got the idea that the social workers were going to come back and take Oswald away from her. And she skipped town and went back to New Orleans, where she had family and where Oswald went to high school. But Oswald, apparently, as a high school student, would go over to friends' houses and start spouting about communism. And the parents of his friends would hear this and they'd say, "Don't bring that kid back here again. He's a 16-year-old communist." So somehow Oswald had glommed on to his left-wing ideas pretty early in life, perhaps as a consequence of this residence in New York City for a period of time.
So it doesn't sound like there was a Mr. Oswald around, pair.
No, where Oswald's father kind of left the family at a young age and he was raised by his mother. I forget if Oswald's father died or he just took off.
Yeah. So you know the story of was it Franklin Marshall Davis?
You mean the guy who knew Obama?
Right. It was what is her name? Stanley Dunham.
Yeah.
Stanley. What?
Yeah.
I forget what Stanley's her first name. Whatever.
Dunham is the last name of the
mother's name Stanley, which is odd, but
yeah.
She did quasi pornographic. I mean, for the time, there were pornographic photos for Franklin Marshall Davis, who was a communist from Philadelphia and a writer, and hanging out and writing literally like Bernie Sanders, kind of writing pornography for money, and I guess filming a little bit of it, and maybe consorting with Ms. Dunham, who had maybe had this guy Barack Obama Sr. pass through, but who knows? The photos look. I don't want to do conspiracy stuff, but I think Barack looks a lot more like Franklin Marshall Davis than he does like Barack Obama Sr. But he spent time in the salon basically of Franklin Marshall Davis, who was pals with Dunham's parents, that is Barack's grandparents.
Yeah, they were very left wing.
And so again, absent father, unless Franklin Marshall Davis announced it, whatever. But either way, whether he was the occult father in the room, or or just kind of the father representative, young Barack, I think, had his his chum gang, his kind of drug dealing aspect and kind of dissolution, try to get away from life. I'm not sure how good a student he was or wasn't at the time, but there's kind of like the kind of some kids went to gangs, and I guess some kids go into wayward political theorizing. I don't know if, where that's going, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on whether the absent father kind of works in.
I mean, also it's kind of interesting because he did spend 2.5 years in the Marine Corps. And, the Marine Corps often shapes up a lot of kids who are wayward and don't know where they're going. But it was not the case with Oswald. Oswald's communist sympathies persisted through his time in the Marine Corps. And to the point where he wanted an early release to take care of his mother. But instead, his idea was to go to the Soviet Union. So now there are conspiracy theorists who think it was the CIA who sent him to the Soviet Union. There's no evidence for that. It's probably not true. But the Obama case is kind of interesting. All this took place in Hawaii, I think, where he met all these people.
Mm-hmm.
And his mother Actually, his mother took off as well, I think, to become she was a sociologist and was studying in Indonesia. I don't know if Barack Obama went with her.
Well, that's later on when Barry was young child, like 7, 8, 9, whatever, those early ages. She met Satoru. I forget his first name, but he was also he was another economics uh, communist. He was an economic professor. So I don't know, their household was interesting, and I don't know how much influence it was through the grandparents, who were probably Communist Party members, and Franklin Marshall Davis, who was. But that was kind of their coterie. And so these other professors somehow glided through their world. Barack Obama Sr. was a Marxist economics professor from Kenya on some kind of sabbatical, whatever, in Hawaii. And I guess Satoru was as well. He's another Marxist economics professor. He later went on to make some money in Indonesia, but that's where Barry Obama kind of took up the name Barry Soetoro. That was the name he applied to colleges for when he went to Occidental and whatnot. But yeah, so I don't know what the deal is. I mean, it was one. It was either going to, his stepfather was the Marxist economics professor. His putative real father was a Marxist economics professor. His possible biologic father was a Marxist writer. It's like, and his grandparents presumably were the same, as well as Stanley Lee Dunham or whatever her name is. It's kind of like a lot. It's a lot there.
Well, in Oswald's case, we have no evidence that he was tutored by anybody. He was a kind of a self-taught communist, which is somewhat unusual too. He may have gotten a lot of communist propaganda when he went to the Soviet Union, but prior to that, a lot of it was self-taught. When he did come back, he subscribed to the socialist magazines, and of course, tried to open up a franchise in New Orleans for Fair Play for Cuba in the summer of 1963. That's well known. They have photos of him circulating literature on behalf of Castro in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. He fled to New Orleans after he tried to shoot the head of the John Birch Society and missed in April of 1963. He thought the police were going to be on to him. His wife knew that he had done this, which, points in a question that you raised. What about his wife? Well, she knew that he took a shot at the head of the Birch Society, and she knew he had this rifle, but didn't tell anybody about it. So they fled to New Orleans, and they spent the summer of 1963 in New Orleans, where he opened up a Fair Play for Cuba operation and was on television actually debating some anti-communists about Castro in New Orleans. And in one of these interviews, one of the men debating him pointed out that he had actually fled to the Soviet Union before coming back. And that implication of that was that Castro is just a puppet of the Soviet Union, which is the kind of a point he wanted to argue against. But he was embarrassed when they brought this up because he didn't know that anybody knew that he had defected to the Soviet Union. But that goes back to your point. His communist and left-wing associations were extremely well known. Him circulating flyers on behalf of Castro, those films were put on TV the day after the assassination. But, nobody really ever put two and two together and said this guy killed Kennedy because he's a communist. Now, it was true that one of the prosecutors in Dallas the day after the assassination said to the press that Kennedy had been killed as a part of a communist conspiracy. Johnson, or somebody representing President Johnson from the Justice Department, got on the phone and told the people in Dallas, the prosecutors, to stop talking like that. We don't want this to become, we don't want Americans to become paranoid that Kennedy was killed by the communists, which provided a pretext for changing the subject. But I was going to say about Oswald, the CIA had a defector from the Soviet Union in 1962 and 1963 who was giving them information about the Soviets. And when Kennedy was killed, and they believed him, when Kennedy was killed, this defector said the Soviets are going to send another defector over to say that Oswald was never part of the Soviet government, that he'd reviewed the files and there was nothing to it. Sure enough, a defector did show up in January 1964 with precisely that message. And because of that, the CIA didn't believe him. They kept him under house arrest for 3 years, interrogating and questioning him until they finally had to let him go in about 1968 or 69, and he continued to live in the United States. But, any record that he would have been linked to the Soviet government, those files would have been destroyed the day of the assassination. So you can be sure there's nothing left. In regard to the CIA, the files that have just been released, most of it appears to be CIA related. Stuff the CIA was doing, Castro stuff. And that makes a lot of sense because the CIA would have kept all the information regarding them undercover and secret. That would have been the last stuff that would ever be released, anything linked to the CIA, because they more or less controlled the release of it. So I was not surprised to find out that much of this material was CIA related. It doesn't, none of it, so far as I can tell, sheds much light on the assassination. Some of it deals with the aftermath, the plots against Castro, and the failure to reveal this information to the Warren Commission.
So just a kind of few loose edges, and then I'll let you go. Jack Ruby, my understanding is it was maybe a little bit of a patriotic streak. I don't know. I mean, despite it sounds inimical for a mobster, as it were. But, you can sort of imagine Tony Soprano maybe, or one of his minions having a, America pride and whatnot. And this is still our place and whatever. So that's kind of a loose thread, loose end. Was it derelict on behalf of the Dallas authorities to leave him Oswald exposed to such a shot? Why do they perp walk him quasi public like that?
Yeah.
And a few other things, but let's start with that one.
Okay, so Ruby, who was Ruby? The Dallas police headquarters was a total madhouse in the wake of the assassination. Journalists were all over the place. Hangers-on were all over the place. Everybody was there. Politicians were there. You can see on some of the films as Oswald is being led through police headquarters, even before he was shot. The hallways are crowded with people. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who worked for Kennedy at the time, a young man now, said that the feds ought to take custody of Oswald because he's in danger of being shot down there after he saw some of these films. Oswald was arraigned on Friday evening and before a judge in police headquarters. And they have films of Ruby in the back of that room as Oswald is being arraigned. This is Friday evening. And it's not until Sunday morning that he shoots him. So there is a sense that Ruby is somewhat stalking this situation. Now, Ruby owned a nightclub where girls danced and so on, and may have been some prostitution linked to that and so on. And he was a rough guy. He beat up some of the girls who worked for him. He had to run a bar after all. And he knew the police because he had to pay them off occasionally to get his girls off and to do some other stuff. So he was a guy about town, a roughneck of sorts who carried a pistol. And he was to some extent stalking Oswald. Did he have a plan to assassinate Oswald? One of the things is that probably half the country might have shot Oswald at that time if they had a chance, because they were so disgusted with what happened. But the Dallas police let the thing get way out of control in the terms of all the people who were running around police headquarters, and why they announced in advance they were moving Oswald at a certain time, which they did. Why did they let the journalists assemble around him to shout questions at him? Another good question. But that area where Oswald was taken to get in the car to take him to another jail, it was about a 20-foot walk to the car in an underground parkway. And it was crowded with journalists who had microphones and all that. Ruby parked his car outside down the street. He sent some money by Western Union to someone, and he left his dog in the car and saw the commotion and wandered over. And, when Oswald came out, pulled his gun and shot him. Did he have a plan to do that? It's probably more opportunistic. But Ruby thought when he shot Oswald that he was going to be released immediately and would be a hero across the country for having assassinated Oswald and kept Mrs. Kennedy from having to come back to do a trial. So he was somewhat shocked when this didn't happen, and he was held. So he was shocked doubly when people began to say he was part of the conspiracy, because that was never anything on his mind, that when he shot Oswald, that people would say he was part of the conspiracy to kill Kennedy. He never considered that, and he testified to that effect to the Warren Commission, that none of this was true. So, the Ruby thing was probably opportunistic, and the opportunity was opened up because the Dallas police were irresponsible and letting so many people run through the headquarters in the wake of such a sensational event. The other thing is, we don't let our presidents drive through crowded streets in open air limousines anymore. That is obviously an invitation to disaster. They don't do that anymore. Actually, I think somebody took a shot at FDR in an open air parade in the 1932. But that was something that allowed Oswald to take that shot. The other thing people wonder about is, how was it that the motorcade passed under Oswald's place of work, place of employment? That seems like a strange coincidence. And it was. It was one of the coincidences that, made the event, that has cast a pall of doubt over the whole thing.
Did they release the motorcade plans earlier?
On the Tuesday before the Friday of the event. So Oswald saw the motorcade route.
Yeah, it sounds like, that sounds like the ice cream dropping.
Yes.
In this guy's lap. He had taken, literally pot shot at John Birch. Not your standard right-wing plot to do so. So kind of mopping up, just a couple of questions. Before, one is, what was the denouement of Jack Ruby? I mean, I forget what happened with him.
He died of cancer 4 years later in jail. Okay.
And then, it seems ironic, maybe not ironic, that Jack Ruby, let's say, caught this not the coronavirus, but the communist virus, this virus of thought, in a sense, from New York City, possibly based on the Rosenbergs, and they were, Alger Hiss was innocent forever in the New York press. Probably, I'm not sure about the New York Times, but until he was guilty. The Venona papers showed that he was a spy. Whittaker Chambers was vilified. Richard Nixon was vilified for pointing out essentially the obvious and the truth. And nobody wants to hear about that stuff. I'm sure it's kind of aged out, but if you get maybe the coterie of people, in ages between yours and mine, I'm sure they all think Alger Hiss is innocent, and he was hounded and whatnot. Richard Nixon was a scoundrel for pointing him out, and Whittaker Chambers was a moron. whatever. But the Russian, so excuse me, the Soviet documents prove that out, bear that out. And so I suppose a last kind of question emanating from that would be: were there any Venona 2 type things, at the fall of the Soviet? And is there anything else to find out amongst their own JFK files?
Nothing on JFK. A lot of people thought after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, some stuff might come out, but nothing really did. There are people who went into the Soviet Union and pulled out documents and wrote books on it. And we did have some spies in that period. I'm not sure if any of it was revealed in any of those documents. You're right about Elder Hiss. Even after Hiss was convicted, the left-wing press claimed he was innocent and had been framed. There's an interesting story that, Morton Sobel, who was one of the conspirators with the Rosenbergs, he fled to Mexico when this got out, and he was arrested and brought back and tried. And he was sent to jail for about 15 years. I think he was released in the late 1960s. And he lived on to about age 98 or something like that. He only died 10 or 15 years ago. But before he died, he did give an interview to the New York Times in which he said, yeah, we were spies. We did it. If you want to call it that, yeah, we were spies. And, he admitted it now, like 50 years after the fact in 2010. There was a guy, a well-known left-winger, who had claimed that it had always been a frame-up, and he was very ill. And his wife read the story in the New York Times about Sobel admitting they were spies. And she said, I didn't have the heart to tell my husband. He always was convinced it was a frame-up, and I didn't want to disturb him so late in life when he was sick. So, they were totally convinced of that. And it is kind of interesting that, some radicals in the past, when they went on trial, they stood up and said, yeah, I did this for this reason, and so on. And they defend themselves in that way. But the communists did not do that. They said they weren't communists and didn't do it, which was an interesting aspect of the whole thing.
It's just kind of a sadness in a way that, Oswald was kind of outraged by a falsehood, and I think we see that over and over again, that people are outraged by what are basically underlying falsehoods.
Yes. Yeah. The Kennedy assassination is now almost 62 years in the past. So it's kind of passed into history now. I don't think we'll have any new information about it.
I think you're eliminating the possibility of time travel.
I haven't thought of that one. No.
Well, thank God we have Oliver Stone and Don DeLillo to weave new stories. It just seems like people are pretty much in medicine, in psychiatry, basically the phrase delusion is we have kind of a mnemonic for it. It's FFF, is fixed false facts.
Yeah.
That is, you assume it's a fact and it's false and it's totally fixed in your mind. You can't get away from it. That's a delusion. It seems like so much of what we have, and that's actually the name of my podcast here, videocast, is false facts fixed. So I'm playing on that to play, on that, is to kind of rectify things to get to a place where the actual record is something that will base people more wholly within the realm of the truth. But we just see it over and over again that lies get propagated, and the truth. What is it? The truth can't get its pants on until lies have traveled around the world. Yeah,
there's a popular song in the 1960s that had a verse: "A man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest." And that's.
And I was thinking with the embassy episode that Lee Harvey Oswald wanting to give up his passport. I was thinking, if you just wait a little bit, with the way John Kerry, who's nearly his contemporary, a little bit younger, tossed his quote unquote tossed his medals and whatnot. Oswald maybe later could have just run for president. I mean, wouldn't that have been easier?
Well, if Oswald had lived, God knows what would have happened to him. But
He could have become Obama's speechwriter. I mean, look what happened to what's his name, Ayers,
Bill Ayers,
Bill Ayers.
yeah,
I mean, probably as radical as Lee Harvey Oswald, a little bit better educated. I think he went to was he part of the Columbia Underground, whatever. And here are guys like almost literally bomb throwers and whatnot. And I guess Obama was basically nurtured in between the Franklin Marshall Davis salon into Bill Ayers kind of radical
yeah,
cell, if you will, in Chicago. Amazing stuff. And so Lee Harvey Oswald, kind of like Angela Davis, literally got refuge, I think, in Cuba. If he had hung around a little bit, not shot as many people, he could have become a professor.
yes. They Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers were a couple, and they were radicals in the '60s, bomb throwers and all that. A friend of mine was visiting to give a talk up at a college in Maine, Bates or Colby, and who was up there giving lectures and spending the semester in residence, but Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers
Yeah.
on the college campus up there. So yes, they have an afterlife and that sort of thing.
It's incredible.
Yeah,
It's incredible. I mean, I treated patients outside of Boston for nearly 30 years, and one of my guys was a ex-police officer, and he just was irate because one of his buddies had been blown up by the Bernadette by the Dorn crowd. I forget the name of that episode, but it's
there
like,
was a robbery, maybe I'm not sure, of some sort of bank robbery up in
yeah,
Boston, roughly 1969 or 70,
yeah.
when a policeman or two were killed. And
Yeah, it's like it's a totally different take. They don't quite get the romance of the revolution when their buddies get killed and they get maimed.
a couple of the women who were involved in that went underground, and
Yeah,
they were captured 10, 20 years later, and they were given very light sentences.
yeah,
And of course, you had the robbery here in New York in 1981, where a group of radicals hijacked, I think it was a Brinks truck,
yeah,
and two cops were killed. And one of the ringleaders did go to prison for 20 years, but was then let out. But, they got fairly light punishment, and she became a professor at Columbia when she got let out.
yeah. That's all the news out of Columbia is shocking. I'll give you.
There is an Elger Hist chair of history at Bard College.
It's amazing. Is it red?
Yeah, it's still there. Yes, I don't
Yeah,
know.
no. I'll give you one. This may be a little off color, but my Columbia story. My older brother went to Columbia, then went to Columbia Journalism School. He hung around Columbia thereafter, so he's got a lot of Columbia, powder blue in his blood probably. But we went to pick him up. First year he still stayed at home, and we went back and forth to pick him up. He was working late and whatnot, and so we were right at the main gate there on Broadway. I don't know, like 116th or whatever it is, 114th, something like that. And my folks, we were in whatever the family car was at the time, was maybe kind of a late model. We used to get used Cadillacs. And we were parked right there because we could. And there must have been some demonstration. This is probably 1972 or 3. Some kind of student demonstration, in the aftermath of all the big radical stuff. And they were, coming back with signs and so forth back at the campus. And we were just sitting in the car waiting for my brother. There were 4 of us maybe at the time, my younger brother too. And we were just sitting in the car waiting because that was the way to pick him up rather than have him take the subway, danger, blah, blah, blah. And they just saw us. And because it was like a 7, 8, 10-year-old Cadillac, they're like, oh, bourgeois pigs, whatever. They're yelling at the car because it's a Cadillac. And they come up to us and there's start to rock our car back and forth. And my dad was a big man. He was like 6'3", which is big at the time, even relatively. and he's going to get out of the car and go, fight them. And I remember there's like holding him on for dear life. Don't go out there because there's so many, whatever. Like nothing good's going to happen to this. And he's like screaming. He's going, not the car's rocking back and forth. And this one of the young kind of bearded kind of guy, he gets up on the car and he pulls his pants down and moons us right in the front windshield. So that's my enduring memory of Columbia radicalism. I got to see his actual brain when he was sitting on us.
Yeah, that's quite a story.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That was, Columbia and a few other schools are very much like that. Yeah. And of course, the big riots occurred in 1968. And the stories that people tell about what happened when they took over the president's office, in some of the professors' offices, what they left behind, tearing up correspondence, manuscripts, doing all sorts of horrible stuff.
Well, thank God that kind of stuff, taking over Hamilton Hall. Thank God that was just a one-off, never happened again, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, they did it last year, and it's even worse because, the causes are worse, Hamas and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing. Douglas Murray, I keep promising we're going to end the show, but just one last night. He talks about Hamas versus Nazi Germany. He said the Nazis had to hide what they did because the hoi polloi man on the street, they had some compunction potentially or morals or whatnot. But if you just did whatever you wanted to do in the Israeli settlements, if you just brought them back and did it right on the streets, you'd be applauded. It was a totally different, this is kind of like Nazism on steroids. It's just Nazism everywhere.
Yeah, the Nazis knew what they were doing was wrong and tried to hide it.
Yeah, and Hamas is hugely proud of it, and they make demonstrations about it, whatever. And these are the guys that Columbia, and it's kind of the analog of defending the Rosenbergs and whatnot, which was also wrong. And they're doing exactly the same, and it's like they're doing it with worse heroes. It just seems, I think that the Rosenbergs were misguided, and they were seditious, and they committed treason, but still probably head and shoulders above Hamas. And it's just a funny time.
Well, the idea that Columbia University has turned into a hotbed for Hamas is pretty crazy, because when you think about all the Jewish professors and thinkers and leaders who've been at Columbia and all the students at Columbia on the Upper West Side of New York, the fact that it's turned into, a hotbed for Hamas and the horrible things they do is very strange.
Yeah, I think the common thread is it doesn't matter what the enemy is as long as it hates us. It hates what's here. It's kind of like the socialist credo is just to hate. I mean, I think it's politics of envy, and I think it's a lot of hatred for what you have. You didn't get the stuff. You weren't smart enough, talented enough to become Elon Musk. So therefore, if he has something, it's because he stole it. Every bit of wealth is by theft, and therefore you have to kind of go get it back and whatnot. It's kind of like the revenge of the incompetent. I didn't make it into the NFL. It's not because I'm not talented, because everyone there is evil.
Yeah. Well, some people have said that there's a strong element in the liberals and progressives and leftists who think that there are two Americas. There's a good America, which is them, and people who think like them. And then there's a bad America represented by Donald Trump and all of his voters. And the job of the good America is somehow to subdue this bad America.
Yeah.
And that's more or less how they think.
Yeah. And it's violent, and it's just funny. But they're Antifa, they're anti-fascists. So God bless them, right?
Yeah. Even though they use the same methods.
Yeah. Funny stuff. Well, thank you, James Piereson. I'm going to put up your book so people can see it and hopefully buy it. It's a great read. I actually have a copy, but maybe I can get another copy and have you sign it for me at some point.
Happy to do it. Sure.
I'm going to be in New York in May. I don't know if you're in the city or not. But
Email me your address and I'll send you a book.
all right, well, that would be lovely. And if people want to help support my podcast here, um, let's see if I can find my book. This has nothing to do with anything we're talking about, but it's Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was, so they can buy the book. Even better if they read it. It's disappeared, and nobody explains why except for me, because there was really, as Gertrude Stein once said, there was really no there. She was talking about Oakland, which actually I'm going to be in May also. I was talking about Zika. There's really no foundational science that ties them, but the narrative took hold, and that's another story for another day. So thank you, James. People can follow you at the Manhattan Institute, and you have a great article from about a decade ago on the JFK bit, and people can find that. I'll try to put a link to it. So thank you so much for being on my show.
Thank you. Appreciate it.